Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies, the program that's always trying to find things at the edge of reality to talk about. I'm Dan Hall with the Olympia Paranormal Research Group, and my broadcast partner here,
Dave Jinks.
Dave Jinks.
Good to be with you again, Dan.
Yeah, nice to be with you as well. Last time we got together, we talked about horror movies and what scares us. So this show may be somewhat of a variable on that topic. We decided to talk about some of our favorite cryptids. And some of those cryptids are in the news, so seem to be kind of topical. Now, if you're sitting there wherever you're at, and sometimes it's interesting to look at the demographics of who listens to these podcasts, but wherever you're at, if you're going, well, what the heck is a cryptid? Maybe we ought to define that. Cryptids basically would be unknown animals or unclassified animals. Or what would you add to that? Anything, Dave?
Well, I think crypt technically means hidden, right?
Hidden,
so
right.
It's kind of an officially undiscovered creature would be my thoughts about the definition of crypto and cryptid in this case.
Okay, and I think those are very good thoughts about that definition. So there are a lot of, I can go back and think about a lot of unknown animals that have interested me. There are things like the Loch Ness Monster. That might be something from when I was growing up that I had an interest in. And then later there are things like Chupacabra. But the two I think that we kind of said that we'd focus on tonight and draw our interest, the first one would be Sasquatch or Bigfoot. And we've already had an episode of Anomalies where, while I was up in Bellingham, I interviewed a couple of Sasquatch experiencers from the Bellingham Observers of the Odd and Obscure. So we're not necessarily going to go down that road, but there's some really interesting current information about Bigfoot. And then the other thing we might talk about in the second half of tonight's podcast would be something called the man-wolf, or probably the phenomena started with something called the Michigan Dog Man, which is an upright wolf that seems to walk around the country terrifying the hell out of people, and kind of reminds us all of the old tale of the werewolf. So tonight, Bigfoot and werewolves. Dave, why don't you start us out with what's going on in the world of Bigfoot? There's some news there.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I consider the topics that we discuss, routinely I always put Bigfoot at the top of my list as far as a no-brainer, because I think there's so much evidence that Bigfoot is real. We've got hundreds, thousands of reports over centuries probably, and a lot of them are credible reports. We've got a lot of Native American reports that you assume are not attention-getting types of reports, but we also have lots of police officers and other law enforcement reports that clearly would not be for the purpose of seeking publicity also. So we've got a lot of those. We also have, of course, the famous film, the Gimlin-Patterson film.
Mm-hmm.
We do have lots of imagery also that's highly suggestive, and now we do have apparently some pretty rigorous DNA evidence that's been provided by a veterinarian, which when I heard that really drew my attention to the case, because I happen to be married to a veterinarian, right, and we own a veterinary hospital. So
let's put in a plug for Companion Veterinary Hospital.
Companion Veterinary Hospital on Ruddle Road, where it meets Yelm Highway.
Yeah, and I've entrusted my animals to the care of Dave's wife, and I'm very sacified with that.
We do appreciate that, having seen your pets come through the doors, and some of them have left us, but you've still got a couple big uns that, only one of them's really big. The other one's just more of an average.
And neither of them look like Bigfoot, so.
That's true. I'm still waiting for a Bigfoot to come in the door one day.
Right.
I will consider that the pinnacle of my veterinary career.
Piece de resistance.
Yeah, let's not get too far off track. But the point is that there is a veterinarian who's also apparently a highly skilled geneticist or a DNA researcher. Her name is Dr. Melba Ketchum. I believe she's based in Texas, and she's the owner, or at least part owner, of a DNA Diagnostics is the outfit. And apparently her outfit was approached by somebody with material that they claimed was DNA, or potentially DNA material from a Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I guess we use those terms interchangeably in this country. And all told, I believe she accumulated 111 different samples, or 111 samples in total. Some of them are from the same sites, but a wide variety of sites still. And after 5 years of study, she has released the results, and it appears to be definitively in favor of a human hybrid in terms of DNA, and as far as what's describing the samples. And according to Dr. Ketchum, this is, again, definitive. It proves the existence of Bigfoot. And it proves the existence of Bigfoot in a category that has managed to annoy not only mainstream scientists, but also the cryptozoologists, or the people who study Bigfoot, who have assumed all along that Bigfoot is an ape. Well, what the study implies is that Bigfoot is neither an ape nor a human, but somehow a mixture of the two. And I do have the full report. It's available at the De Novo Journal site. You can Google that.
Is that D-I-N-O-V-O?
I think it's D-E-N-O-V-O.
Okay.
It may be Latin, I'm not sure. I know some French, so I would pronounce it De Novo, but obviously it means new in whatever language, and it looks at new phenomena, and this is certainly a new and groundbreaking study. Now, there is controversy surrounding it and lots of drama, but the paper itself, if you get a chance to look at it, it is rigorously scientific to the point where I have to admit I don't understand most of it because it's all DNA discussion, genetics discussion, but it is packed full of hard data, which is something that's typically missing in study of Sasquatch or UFOs or any other sort of what we might call paranormal research areas. And so that's the big announcement. That's seriously a week old or something. And you and I both heard Dr. Ketchum on Coast to Coast, the radio show that deals with these sorts of things. And I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with Coast to Coast. And that's kind of the big breakthrough. I guess that's something to talk about a little bit here when we talk about Sasquatch.
So the kind of distilling the big news, Sasquatch is real. It's not a mythological creature. It's not something somebody made up, because now you have physical evidence of it, at least according to Melba Ketchum. And then the other piece of news, which is a little bit more ambiguous, is that it's related to us in a way that we probably didn't think it was related to us. Now, I haven't downloaded the study. I've only listened to Melba Ketchum on Coast to Coast AM and maybe one other media source. I don't recall her ever saying that, kind of completing the sentence in terms of Sasquatch is a hybrid between a human and then I don't remember really hearing her state what the other part of the hybrid situation would be. Now, is that, realizing you said you haven't been able to get through the whole report, do you have any other insights into that as to what Sasquatch might be a hybrid, a human hybrid of?
Well, I've combed through the entire report, and like I said, I just cannot, I don't understand the hardcore genetics and all that, so I don't know if there is a conclusion. She came to 2 or 3 different possible conclusions about the origins of this creature, and one of them was basically a human mating with, I think it was a human mating with a Sasquatch, which doesn't tell us anything about the origins of Sasquatch itself. But I guess the implication is that there were Bigfoot or Sasquatch in existence, at least in either before or in parallel with humans, and at some point the two got together, and that's what she's seeing in the DNA, at least of these particular specimens.
What I find kind of interesting is, of course, the criticism, which you would expect with something of this magnitude. But it's almost like some of the criticism that I've looked at kind of glosses over the fact that, hey, there's proof of a unknown species out there, and seems to quibble about what the species is, and somehow that loses, and I don't know if this is intentional by the people who are criticizing the study, but somehow the quibbling about what the composition really of Sasquatch is all about seems to somehow denigrate the idea that it exists at all. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, and of course we see that all through these fields as far as maybe a UFO or a crop circle or something, that when it's shown in a court of law, when you get to the point where the jury would decide in your favor, it's over, right? It's true, but you still have to go back and say, well, what does it mean, and also what's the theory behind it? If you can't explain what a UFO is or where it comes from, then should we ignore the fact that there's a UFO? So you're saying, we don't know the history of Sasquatch, so can we safely ignore the fact that it's living in our forests miles down the road? Well, obviously no normal, rational person will say, oh, sure, our cold fusion is another great example of that. It's like we're getting excess energy, but we don't know why, so just ignore it. It makes no sense if you're a real scientist. And I know I just introduced several other things here, but it's all the same sort of...
They're parallel kind of
Yeah,
things.
same sort of issue when you have a novel phenomenon and you don't have a solid theory behind it. It always runs into these sorts of issues. And if you're just an armchair skeptic and you sit back and you throw stuff out and see what sticks, eventually you'll wear people down to the point where they'll say, well, maybe you're right. Maybe that's all just a bunch of hooey.
But I guess that's kind of what I was thinking about, because, and I certainly don't fall into the category of a geneticist or a natural science person at all. I'm a social science guy, But I'm thinking about people who for a long time have said that Sasquatch is probably some kind of a remnant of an ape. And the ape that usually comes up in the discussion was a long dead creature called Gigantopithecus blacki, and I can remember somebody finding, this goes back quite a while, somebody finding a fossil evidence of the jaw of one of these creatures, and then they reconstructed, and I think this is kind of fascinating how they do that, they reconstructed the body just based on the jaw. Well, so what you get is something that looks like somewhere between 6 and 10 foot tall, kind of orange-colored ape. So if Melba Ketchum's DNA evidence disputes that, then I guess what I'm a little bothered by are those people who might be prone to say, well, this is an ape, not a human hybrid, to use that as some way to discredit the study. I mean, the study would seem to speak on its own, to be valid on its own, and just because it doesn't come to the conclusion that some person who thinks it was a Gigantopithecus blacki, if that's the explanation of Bigfoot, that just because it doesn't match their conclusion, I'm not sure how that would invalidate the study. But that seems to be out there. That point of view seems to be out there.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant by it. It managed to annoy the skeptics who insist that there's no evidence whatsoever for this mythical creature. Now they're suddenly faced with, wow, there's DNA. It's not easily waved away with the hand wave, and the cryptozoology people are now saying, well, this isn't what we thought Bigfoot should be, so it can't be true either. So she's getting it from both sides. The great thing about Dr. Ketchum, though, is that she is not backing down. She's obviously invested a lot of effort into this, and she freely admits that she wishes she never got into this.
I think I recall her saying that.
She says point blank that it's ruined her career. She took the project on as an open-minded scientist looking to have some work to do, and I'm sure she was interested in the subject matter. It had to be less routine than what she's used to seeing. So she took it on, but I'm sure she didn't expect it to be like this, the way it turned out. However, like you said, the point is that what she's discovered appears to be indisputable evidence that the DNA is not human. There's no possibility whatsoever of contamination either. That's, of course, what she sought to rule out first. But it's clearly not an ape either, so it's some hybrid, and I think that science will have to deal with that at some point. Right now it's sort of still a ha-ha piece on the various media outlets that happened to cover the story, the few that did, and there's a lot of drama and a lot of mystery surrounding at this point. But I think that the bottom line it will be there for us to have to deal with at some point.
Well, now I'm going to play skeptic here, in a sense, and I'm not a skeptic. I mean, I have. If you go back to that interview that I did in Bellingham with those two Bigfoot experiencers, very credible people. I believe that they saw a creature that we're calling Sasquatch, regardless of what it might be. But one of the criticisms, and this is the playing skeptic here, about Melba Ketchum's study, and you could kind of see it coming once she announced it, was, as I recall the story here, Melba tries to get a peer-reviewed journal, peer-reviewed science journal, to publish these findings. And if you listen to the piece with George Knapp on Coast to Coast AM, she relates a story that just when they were about to do that, that journal backed out, based on legal advice to back out. And it probably had something to do with the reputation of the journal. So then the story, as I understand it, and if you have some other details, please chime in here, that in order to kind of not have to face this as an ongoing problem where some scientific peer-reviewed journal doesn't want to, have a story, publish a paper about Bigfoot because of the kind of stigma associated to Bigfoot, she then purchased this de novo journal that you talked about and went ahead and published that. Now, to play the skeptic here, that seems a bit suspicious to some people. Right. That if you can't get anybody to publish your study, and maybe because, and Melba Ketchum in the interviews that I've heard seems to have done impeccable work, but if you can't get anybody to publish your study, the implication is maybe because they're thinking it's not impeccable work. So does it have any effect? And I'm guessing from your answer, maybe I got a sense of what it might be. Does it have any effect for you that she essentially has to publish? She publishes her paper, but she only does so after she purchases the journal in which to publish it. Does that seem to somehow dilute the findings?
Well, if you're laboring under the illusion, as most self-styled skeptics are, that scientific journals actively seek out topics that will destroy their journal, then you might be surprised that this is what happened in the end. But as far as I understand, she went to the major relevant journals. All of them but a couple said thanks but no thanks at the door. They didn't want to look at any of the data. They didn't care that she had 5 years' worth of micron electroscopy.
That's hard to say.
Yeah, I can't even say it, let alone understand exactly what's happening. But they didn't care that she had all this genetic analysis, DNA material, did all the things that a good DNA diagnostic lab should do, accounted for contamination, all of the other issues that were bound to come up. They didn't care. They just said no thanks. Because what journal, I mean, I have skeptics ask me this all the time, and they're just, incredulous about it. They say, but nature would love to be the one to break this story if it was true. And I paint a picture for them, and I say, would you just picture, Nature or Science or one of these journals that's been around for 200 years or whatever. They've got all these pictures of Einstein and whoever on the front, and all of a sudden here in 2013 they've got Bigfoot. And tell me that wouldn't instantly destroy their credibility in the eyes of a large number of subscribers, if not the vast majority. And once you think about it that way, you think, well, maybe that was a bit of a risk, because even if the data looked solid, what if it turned out that Ketchum was deluded, or she got fooled herself, or there was some major issue? You would never be able to get that Bigfoot off your cover.
Right. That would just destroy your credibility as a journal.
Right. So you got suckered once. You don't get a chance to get suckered again if you're one of these big journals. So I'm not laboring under the illusion that those journals would jump at the chance. I think most of them would say, nah, I don't think so. And that's that's pretty much what happened. I think Dr. Ketchum was a little bit naive in thinking that she would be accepted. But then again, she had so much data and 5-year study, that's enough to get you published. It should be. So, again, as far as I understand from her interview, she went to a couple journals. They did the peer review, the blind peer review process. The other one, I don't know which one it was. She didn't say. It basically bowed out and said, this is just too hot of a topic for us to touch at this point. And so the De Novo journal, they went through the peer review, the blind peer review, and they said the data was okay. They had a few minor criticisms, as I understand, but they passed it, and so it was to be published. But as you mentioned, apparently the attorney for the editor of the journal, some legal advice at least at some point in the process, said, basically he threatened to quit if the journal went ahead and published this. And so when you're Dr. Ketchum, after your 5+ years of work, at that point you know that Nature and Science and all those others aren't going to touch it, and now the ones you thought were going to touch it, they don't want it. They're tossing it away like a hot potato. What are your options at that point? Well, you can self-publish.
Which maybe even stretches your credibility a little bit more.
Right, because everyone says, well, she couldn't even get it in the the bad journal. Or you can take what you have, which is the last remaining journal that did go through the scientific process, and you can take it over somehow. I don't know if she bought it or if the editor resigned, or it's just that part is sketchy, and of course that doesn't help the whole presentation because it distracts from the evidence, and it's just so much easier to talk about that if you're an infotainment outlet, which is basically all we have for news these days. They'll talk about the drama. They won't get into the DNA because that's a really tough subject to discuss anyway, even if you're a highly qualified scientist. So that's kind of where that is, but I think that the paper will eventually stand on its own, and people will, appropriate experts will analyze it over time, and hopefully it'll say what she says it says.
I find myself, as I'm thinking about what's happened to Melba Ketchum, going to kind of a default setting about science. And maybe it's the same default setting you would go to if you're talking about Bigfoot versus ET contact versus ghosts, some of the things that like the Olympia Paranormal Research Group is into. It's like, what is the purpose of science? And I guess I would think, and maybe it's just my own view of it, would be to explain the unexplained. Mm-hmm. So if that's the purpose of science, and I'm just making an assumption here, which is probably wrong, you shouldn't find journals backing away from controversial topics, because the controversial topics have something to do with stuff you don't understand to begin with. So it seems like kind of a circular argument in a way that doesn't make any sense to say, well, because this is new and unusual and it could be weird and far out, we're not going to look into it. When if you go back and think about Galileo saying that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, that seemed pretty far out there too. But hey, he was right, he was right.
The church didn't acknowledge it for 400 years after that. So that mechanism that's in place that grinds discovery to a halt, the gears of discovery, I guess, it's pretty powerful. I think that's what she's run up against. But again, that's why I started my whole spiel with, if you're laboring under the illusion that science works in the way you just described, embracing new ideas and trying to overturn paradigms, well, it doesn't work that way. It just nibbles around the edges of known stuff, and it incorporates small changes to paradigms. It doesn't seek to throw out and overturn things that have been accepted for years and years, even though the history of science shows that that's what happens. Things get thrown out after having been accepted as fact or dogma for decades or centuries.
And maybe to be fairer to science than I just sounded, as you pointed out with Galileo, it wasn't science that was impeding the knowledge of the center of the solar system. It was the Catholic Church, which doesn't seem to be too scientific. I mean, religion's about faith, not about science. The other part of this, we're talking about what are the big talking points here, the big news stories. Bigfoot does exist, but then the second part of the story, I think there's intrigue to all of it, but it's particularly intriguing because if Bigfoot is a human whatever hybrid, then this research has some interesting possibilities as far as what we do with it. Because, and I've heard Melba Ketchum say this in 2 interviews now, that if we're dealing with something that's a hominid or human-like type of thing, a part human, hybrid, then that brings into some ethical issues about what we can do and what we can't do. And one of the things I'm thinking about is that as long as I've been following this Sasquatch story, there have been a group of people who are, I don't know, I'll call them researchers, but they're people who are interested in the topic of Sasquatch or Bigfoot who have said, and I think I may be wrong about that, so I'll fully admit this, I think Dr. Grover Krantz from your alma mater, Washington State, was one of the guys who said this. And I don't think he said this from the standpoint of that's what he wanted to see. It was like it was an inevitability. Mm-hmm. But the only way we're really going to believe that there's a Sasquatch is we've got to shoot one. We've got to find a body of one. Now, once again, that might not have been Kranz's position, but I've been around the Bigfoot community long enough to know that people feel that way. So now, Melba Ketchum, think of what her research says regarding that argument. We essentially have to shoot a human being in order to prove its existence. Now that would be totally, that'd just be out of bounds in a popular culture sense, not just a scientific sense. If we just said, well, in order to prove humanity exists, we've got to get one, put it in a cage, or shoot it, or put it on display. So now we've got this creature that we've mythologized, and she's talking about we need to treat it as if it is one of us. So I wonder what some of the outcomes of that will be. And the one I'm just referring to is that, hey, do you have to throw that idea out there that you can kill one because it's killing a fellow human being?
Yeah, that brings up some really tricky ethical areas, obviously. And as you noted, that's what's caused a rift among the Sasquatch researchers. There were very hardened positions on each side, and the guys who were certain that Sasquatch was just an ape, pure and simple, that really rocks their little world. And so, what do they think about it? Now, Krantz has passed on. I think, as you also noted, I don't think he was of that mind that we need to go shoot one, but I think he believed, as most of us do, that until you have a body in front of you that you're picking apart, you're not going to get mass acceptance from the scientific community. That's just, I guess, the way it's going to be. You would think the DNA would over time convince a lot of scientists that this is something serious, but a body in your face right now under the microscope at Harvard Medical School or wherever would certainly go a long ways towards forcing acceptance. And so, but now can you advocate for that? And I think the answer is pretty clearly, I think, would be no. And you'd have to really do some mental gymnastics to get a yes answer on that.
Well, if you viewed Sasquatch as just an animal, a non-human animal, I guess I am persuaded. I have a friend from college who's a wildlife biologist, and I was thinking about this earlier today, and Tim is his name. And Tim used to talk about, so if you have a population of animals, you need to manage that population. And oftentimes, I think about some of the, here in Washington, what that might mean. I'm kind of involved in the periphery of the wolf conservation movement. So management usually means kill or hunt in some respects. But once you deem a creature a human hybrid, there's no management plan for them other than, any more so than there was a management plan for people who committed genocide against other humans they didn't like. So it seems like that the whole ethical, there's a sea change when it comes to the ethics of even talking about Bigfoot and what we need, whether we need to study it. Is it appropriate? I guess anthropologists go to indigenous cultures and to some degree study them to find out the origins of human beings, but there's an ethical component to that, and sometimes that's not something that the indigenous group wants to have happen. Are we in the same boat with Sasquatch? I mean, do we treat it as an indigenous group? Are there civil rights that need to be accorded to Sasquatch?
Right. Some of it seems crazy, but that is the logical next step if you accept the conclusions of this study, and I don't see how you can avoid considering some of those issues. Now, on the other hand, humans like to think of ourselves as high-minded and ethical, but it hasn't been that long ago that we did come into the Native Americans' land and basically manage their population through various techniques, some of them not at all ethical.
Well, and to kind of maybe I'm glad you brought that up, because to draw a correlation, some of those management plans that we executed as far as Native Americans were concerned were done under the basis that Native Americans weren't human, that they were something less than human. So, I mean, if we can do that to something we know is human, Native American populations, I suppose we're capable of the same type of atrocities against something that we previously considered not to even be related to human beings.
Right, and the whole issue with, even more recently than Native Americans, African Americans with, unfortunately, we now know that experiments were conducted specifically on African Americans because of that same mentality.
Tuskegee Institute experiments,
And I'm sure there are many more that have not yet seen the light of day, or only partially, but, there will be a camp who will say, well, they're big and hairy, so I can't think of them as humans, no matter what their DNA might say. And then there will be the other side, probably us, who will be out picketing, saying, let Sasquatch live.
Set Sasquatch free.
Yeah, let's...
Well, as we're talking here, that's the thought process I'm having. So now PETA becomes pets, people for the ethical treatment of Sasquatch. And so is there going to be some kind of a movement that comes out of this revelation, if Melba's ideas are accepted, that there needs to be an advocacy group? Sasquatches may not be able to advocate for themselves,
it's going to be a mess. I mean, it's definitely going to be a mess, because you're going to have that whole spectrum of people, and then you're going to have still a huge part of the scientific community that's saying, you guys are all crazy because we already know this can't be true. So, but I think that's what scientific revolutions look like anyway. When you hit that point, it's chaos, and I think what Ketchum has done has brought about chaos. I don't think she knew what she was getting into, but it's become clear now that this is an open can of worms, I believe. Barring some gigantic revelation about her data, that it was fabricated, or that there's some major error or whatever, although I find that possibility hard to believe, just given the number of samples. Like I said, over 100 various different places. The analysis seems pretty straightforward as far as what she was doing with the material. I mean, just as one example, in the report it shows a picture of a drain pipe, like a rain gutter. Well, apparently this creature, going after maybe a mouse running up the pipe or something, it chomped on the drain pipe.
Wow.
It twisted it. It left teeth marks.
Oh my gosh.
In an arched pattern, unlike whatever. If you come up with another animal that might chew a drain pipe, I can't think of it. Maybe a bear.
Bear, yeah, I think a bear.
It left this very definite imprint, and it left fresh blood. And it just chewed through this metal drain pipe. And so they got the DNA sample from that. So when you, and another sample is a big chunk of flesh, like a 3-inch long chunk with these long hairs coming out of it. It's not like these were just specks of stuff picked up off the forest floor. I mean, they occurred in association with specific sightings and specific incidents. So I think with the number of samples and just the type of circumstances under which they were acquired, guarantees that they are genuine samples of some creature. And if the DNA says it's not a bear and it's not people and there's no contamination, then you're left with only one conclusion. And again, if you read the report, she went through all the protocols that you would expect. She took samples of her human assistants and used them as control samples against the samples that were being analyzed, so she could completely rule out contamination from the known human participants.
Well, and I think that's an important point to bring in, because I think when we talk about this, and maybe you hear Melba Ketchum discussed in the media, it's like Melba Ketchum's doing all this herself. Well, no. There were many people involved in this study, and as I believe I saw the cover of the report, it had a list of people on there, longer than just Melba Ketchum's name, of people who participated in this kind of research. So, yeah, I mean, it's layers of research rather than just something Melba cooked up.
Yeah, there was something like 11 labs, seven of them independent of Ketchum. I guess Ketchum had some relationship with some of them just because she normally does business, but there were at least a half dozen that were independent who she sent the samples to blind. They came back going, Melba, what the heck is this? It doesn't match anything we have in our database. And that's when she said, aha, you know what that is? It's the Bigfoot, and that's when they hung up the phone or said, you
dropped
gotta
the
be
phone
kidding
or
me.
something, yeah.
So she did this in a very clever scientific way, such that it's going to be very difficult to poke holes in it and destroy the whole argument. So I think, again, I mean, we could step back and say, what is some of the other evidence for Bigfoot? And I could rattle off, and I'm sure you could, a whole bunch of things. We have thousands of footprints. I mean, there are areas where there are dozens of footprints in the same area from a family. Because typically people think, well, it's just
single animal.
It's a single footprint here, and that's all you got. Well, it could have been some guy with a wooden stamper. But there are known areas where families, presumably, are about. So they're footprints, many footprints. There's the film, the images. And one thing I like to say when people say, well, why haven't we found a Bigfoot yet? I point out that in the Pacific Northwest there are at least 40 airplane accidents, crashes that have never been recovered.
Right.
So if you're able to lose 40 airplanes, presumably, unfortunately, with people in them, then what are the odds of running across a species that is both intelligent but also really eager to not make contact with you?
I think that's an important point.
The odds are very low that you'll just stumble upon one.
Right. I think that's an important point because I recall Melba Ketchum trying to characterize the, I don't want to say personality, but maybe it's almost the intelligence of this creature. So she said, imagine a human being who is essentially like an Army Ranger or a Navy SEAL who was totally familiar with their environment, which is not our environment, cities, it's the forest. So how easy would it be for them to escape detection? Well, and once again, they're making an assumption they want to escape detection. Well, pretty easy, I would guess. The answer to that is. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see as this unfolds how her research is accepted and then what might be the outcomes of that. So are there any other things we want to say about Melba Ketchum and Bigfoot, or is it time to move on to the Michigan Dog Man?
Well, I think we can move on to the Dog Man. I'm less familiar with the Dog Man, so that'll be your personal project, but we can discuss it in general.
Yeah, and my only familiarity comes from reading a couple of books. The people that I appreciate in this exploration of the paranormal, and I would include you in that because you're an author. You wrote a book, The Monkey and the Tetrahedron. So I really appreciate those people who author texts about these subjects, but also the people that I would kind of call the investigative journalist. And one of the guys that we just referred to in terms of Melba Ketchum is George Knapp, who's been an investigative journalist for a lot of paranormal topics, running the gamut from Area 51 to the Skinwalker Ranch and the hunt for the Skinwalker. And the person I want to refer to here, Linda S. Godfrey, is an investigative journalist in the Midwest in Wisconsin who's written a bunch of books, and the one that I just got through is The Real Wolfmen, True Encounters in Modern America. And what Linda seems to be trying to chronicle are these sightings of these and the term Wolfmen may be a little bit deceptive, because there's the kind of thought that, well, what she's dealing with is this concept of a werewolf, a human that changes themselves into a wolf. But really what she's chronicling are all these sightings, and there's a map of the United States where most of the eastern and midwestern parts of the United States have had these anecdotal sightings of these, they're originally referred to as dogmen, but now they've become more like wolfmen, because the description of most people is if you imagine a 6 to 7 foot wolf standing on 2 legs rather than on 4, that's what they're seeing. People are coming around corners on late night, on being, out driving on a lonely road, so to speak, the very place you don't want to have a paranormal encounter happen, just waiting down the road for you. And they come around the corner and they see something run across the road, or something standing on the edge of the road that looks like a wolf, but it's standing on 2 legs. And sometimes the descriptions are similar, sometimes they're dissimilar. In terms of the colors, I spent a little bit of time around wolves, and most wolves that I've ever seen have yellow eyes, but some of these wolf men that are described in Linda Godfrey's book sometimes have black eyes, and so that doesn't quite fit with the wolf. But I guess that's the closest model to things. And the first book she wrote, The Beast of Bray Road, I think it was Elkhorn, Michigan, which is where she lives. That's where the first sighting was made. This Beast of Bray Road was one of these, like I said, they originally called it a dog man, but now it's more kind of like a wolf man kind of creature. So that book was interesting to read and to get to think about these kind of creatures out there. But it was thought that was sort of confined to this area. Well, now she has, in this book I just referred to, The Real Wolfman, she has chronicles of these sightings throughout the United States. So maybe to draw kind of the parallel with Bigfoot, there's no DNA that I know. She doesn't talk about any kind of DNA. She's talking about anecdotal evidence. But one of the things that you just referred to, and I'm wondering if it's related to these wolfmen kind of things, is that there are, if you go on the BFRO website, Bigfoot Field Research Organization's website, there's just a ton of sightings that people have had of Bigfoot. Well, I don't know number-wise if the Wolfman sightings are as numerous as the Bigfoot sightings, but it's the same kind of thing. It's, after a while, you get so much anecdotal evidence, you have to say to yourself, well, something's got to be going on, whether or not these are werewolves in the sense that we think of werewolves as being the way they are, the kind of Lon Chaney Jr. character, the old Universal horror movie werewolf, or just some kind of really strange creature that's out there. You got to give some kind of credence without necessarily having like the DNA that we have with Sasquatch.
Well, the thing that comes to my mind, and I don't know exactly why or if it's reasonable, but I immediately want to draw a distinction between Sasquatch and pretty much everything else, including Wolfman and Chupacabra, I don't know, all the various things down south that you hear of, the devil pigs or whatever.
Right.
I mean, any kind of hybrid.
The Jersey Devil.
Yeah, that's probably what I'm thinking of. Those, I immediately want to differentiate those two, and I'm not quite sure why, and maybe it is because of what you just said, and that's that there's been a much more organized search for Bigfoot. It seems to be documented much more extensively. We have all the footprint evidence and visual evidence, and so my thought is Bigfoot is real. All the rest of those things are either misperception or they are some sort of paranormal phenomenon.
Right, and that, I think that's an interesting point, because then it may be just there hasn't been enough attention paid to the dogman, wolfman kinds of creatures versus Bigfoot, but maybe we're just in kind of an evolutionary stage there, so that if we do pay attention, we may find that it, like Sasquatch, is a cryptid that's been around for a long time. We just haven't had enough encounter with it. But there are, in this particular book, though, there are some things that Linda Godfrey talks about that have some paranormal, supernatural kind of components to it. And so I don't know. That's an interesting question. There's once again no body that I know of a wolf that runs around on two legs. So it's interesting to think about this as being something of a supernatural being versus just an undiscovered creature that we don't know anything about.
Yeah, and it could be something even more complicated, which is that humans somehow are creating these entities. They start as a myth but they become, I don't know what the term is, embodied. They become a physical reality. Maybe they're in the process of becoming real. Mm-hmm. Obviously that gets into really speculative areas, but to step back to Bigfoot for just a moment, I after all this DNA stuff, I started thinking about, now what if Bigfoot were the giants spoken of, say, in religious texts?
Right.
What if they were the precursor to human for some reason, or they were the giants spoken of? Is it the Nephilim?
Yeah, Nephilim.
Nephilim. That and that would explain some of the DNA similarities. Maybe the aliens brought the Sasquatch here, and from them the human race was created. You get into all sorts of crazy scenarios, and you bring in even more unknowns, and of course a skeptic is falling off the chair at that point, assuming they haven't already turned the radio off. But there's just so much to consider. But I have a feeling, as far as werewolves and chupacabra and those sorts of demon-like things, it just has a feel to me like it's a spiritual component that's driving that. Maybe, like you said, it just hasn't matured to the point where we've created it enough, or the study of it hasn't matured where we can be more sure about its physical existence.
There's I think it's the first chapter of this book, Linda Godfrey talks about an incident that happened at a school named St. Coletta's, which was essentially a school for exceptional children. Mm-hmm. And the kind of discussion she talks about in the book is that John F. Kennedy's sister was placed there because of some disabilities that she had. So she kind of introduces it in a popular culture where there's a connection of the Kennedy family. But she recounts a story where a guy who's a night watchman goes about his work one night after dark, maybe after midnight, and he comes to a place on the grounds where there's some mounds. And he noticed that there's some kind of creature that is digging in these mounds. And there's actually a picture of it that was drawn by the son, I believe, of the night watchman. The night watchman never wanted to talk about the incident, but told his son, and then after the night watchman died, the son revealed this picture that he drew. And it's really a kind of a striking picture. It was covered in fur, had really powerful arms, very muscular arms. Its hands weren't paws like you'd think that a wolf would have or a dog would have, but the hands ended in kind of like hands with thumbs and pinky fingers. And this creature made some kind of growling noise as the guy approached it, and then it took off. But here's the kind of paranormal kind of thing that went on there. That supposedly at this school too, not too long before the sighting of this dog man, there had been some exorcisms performed by the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And so the connection was made that maybe this creature that was seen by the night watchman and then later drawn by his son was somehow tied into that. Mm-hmm. So, and I know there's that, is Bigfoot, with maybe Melba Ketchum's study kind of disputes this, but there's always been that thing, is Bigfoot a real flesh and blood creature or some kind of paranormal extra-dimensional entity? Well, the same thing could be said about this thing that was seen at St. Coletta's Institute in Wisconsin.
Yeah, it could be that humans are really relatively solidly cemented in this realm, assuming there are other realms, from which things could appear or materialize, just like the quantum soup that scientists talk about popping in and out of existence. That's basically what matter is. So, but what if some of these things are essentially popping in and out of our reality? And that's why there seems to be a wide variety of just these creatures that, and it seems like that, what you described, is a typical case where it's just some entity doing something over in the corner, minding its own business or whatever, and a person happens to stumble on it and see it, and of course be horrified because it doesn't match any creature that we're familiar with. That seems to be the kind of the modus operandi of these types of creatures. You don't really see a lot of cases where the thing just came at me and attacked me and chewed my brain out or anything. Well, of course you would never get that report.
Right.
From the
well, she had a Ouija board.
Maybe. Yeah. But that's what makes me think paranormal. Because a lot of it just doesn't make any sense. Why would this creature be sitting there digging? I mean, what business does it have in the dark? What would it be doing? Where would it go after it was done? What is it looking for? You know, it's something this big and evil looking. Wouldn't it have been seen before wherever it stays? And that to me makes it seem like it's a product of the person who's seeing it, or at least some combination of an entity that somehow materialized because of this witness observing or something like that. But, you know, I could be totally way off, because you could say the same thing for Bigfoot, and now I'm arguing that Bigfoot
is real, because there's DNA evidence of it.
Right, so give me Dogman DNA, and I'll be arguing for its existence and protection, too.
At the end of this book, Linda Gottfried goes through some possible explanations for what these things could be. And some of the explanations do sound paranormal because of connections that seem to be paranormal. For instance, and I don't think I was aware of this on 9/11 until I read the book, that crossroads and rivers in a kind of a folklore tradition seem to attract mystical creatures. And that's where a lot of these sightings occur. Somebody's driving along the river and they happen to look over there, and there's this kind of wolf on two legs standing, you know, by the riverside or underneath the bridge. There's also a connection in here, several instances where people who have been on military bases, or I want to say reservations, but that's not quite what I want to, that sounds more like Native American.
Installations.
Yeah, installations, yeah, that probably would be a better word, where they've seen these kind of things. So it's like, are they tied to particular kinds of things? So she's got those explanations, and then the other explanations are like, okay, and this is a little bit about like the Gigantopithecus type of thing. Have there ever been large kind of creatures like this that have existed in the past where there might be fossil evidence? And one of the things she talks about is a dire wolf, which is a type of wolf that is unlike the modern wolves, in that their legs are much shorter, but they were much bigger, had a much bigger body mass, and were much taller than wolves. But there's no record, fossil or otherwise, that was bipedal. That, you know, it's just the critter that ran around on all four legs. Something else that comes out here is, and this, once again, there's some parallels here with Bigfoot. Several people that I know of who have had Bigfoot encounters, and this particularly might be appropriate to people who are of Native American background. I've heard my friend Sherry, who I interviewed up in Bellingham, say that some Native people who have seen Bigfoot become what they call Indian sick. And the definition of that would be they have some kind of a real strong emotional reaction to seeing Bigfoot, and it sticks with them. This isn't a Native story, but I remember a guy who was a psychologist. This was a coast-to-coast story from several years back. A guy who was a psychologist was hiking with his family on a trip down in southern Oregon, close to the coast, and he needed to use the facility, and the facility was essentially a bush, so he went off of the path that his family was on to do his business, and as he's watching his family, he also has a vantage point of what's further down the trail, and what's further down the trail is a Sasquatch. And this really unnerved him because he thought somehow that would be a threat to his family. Well, I heard him talk about this on Coast to Coast AM probably 2 or 3 years after he had the experience, and he broke down in tears. It was so emotional. And I thought about, so is that what we're talking about when we're talking about Indian sick? Now, to bring it into the Dogman or the Wolfman layer, I guess that's the wrong word. Some of these people who report seeing the Dogman get telepathic messages from these creatures. And essentially, the telepathic telepathic message is don't mess with us. If you report what you see or somehow you try to make a story out of it, we're going to come after you. And that's pretty far-fetched, but maybe has some kind of connection with that Indian sick, that emotional experience that people have when they've seen Bigfoot.
Well, I don't want to get us off on another tangent. I guess that's kind of what we do here. But what it makes me think of, and I even hesitate to go into this realm, but that's when you talk about close encounters, the aliens. When you have reports of the occupants of the craft, or what we presume were occupants. And again, there's a whole body of work here. I'm confident in saying that this does actually happen. I mean, there are lots of reports. Naturally, you don't get as many people saying, hey, I communicated telepathically with a couple aliens the other day. You don't get as many people saying that as you do saying, I saw an odd configuration of lights in the sky. Was that something that the local air base knew something about? You don't sound quite as crazy talking about that. But there are lots and lots of well-documented cases of these, what we would call alien entities. But what always disturbs me about those cases is that they always seem to be doing something so mundane. So they're examining the dirt, or they're picking up a little sample, or they're standing there talking. There's just no urgency.
Right.
They've been here for 1,000 years, but they're still taking dirt samples. It just does not make any sense. Any civilization that had the capability of rendering gravity powerless would certainly be able to remote sense whatever they needed to find in the physical world on Earth, right? I mean, they wouldn't even need to land here to do up-close investigation. Same with, like, cattle mutilation. Do they really need to steal Farmer Brown's cow, take it somewhere, and then drop it unceremoniously and break its bones and, splatter it on the ground? Obviously, there's some message that's being sent in those certain situations. So that's what it makes me think here. The Wolfman is digging in a pile of whatever. He sees a witness looking at him, then he telepathically says, okay, don't mess with me because I'm the Wolfman. I mean, there's something really manufactured about that situation. To me, it's almost as if it was a scene set up to specifically send a message to a particular witness, or it just doesn't seem likely that you'll stumble upon a Wolfman who's digging for grubs or whatever they would eat, or something. Obviously, I guess you could say that occasionally you'll stumble across a creature like this, but it really seems fishy to me. That's what I'm thinking when you're talking about it. But I'd like to hear her other possible explanations, too.
Well, and I mean, some of them are still along the paranormal line. But before we go into that, you talk about kind of getting broad afield by talking about aliens and throwing them in with these men, wolf, dog men kind of creatures. There are people who study the paranormal who have what I would call a unified theory of the paranormal, which says that some of these things are all interconnected. That what we think are aliens could be time travelers, could be interdimensional kinds of travelers. And the way some of these cryptids show up, particularly the one we're talking about here, the man-wolf, they could also be popping in and out of existence. One of her other explanations, which may not be an interdimensional explanation, but certainly not necessarily a flesh and blood explanation, would be the concept of a tulpa. And I think a tulpa comes from Tibetan philosophy, and my understanding of a tulpa is that it's a projection of one's mind, that the mind becomes so powerful that you could materialize something that you're thinking about or that you're imagining. So, people might be imagining kind of monstrous creatures, and then all of a sudden they're projected. So,
I'm looking at the title of that section. It says "Tiny Trickster," and that falls into the realm of gnomes and elves and fairies and sprites.
Right.
And but what is it? Is it a chimera? Is that how you say it? Where it's an invention, sort of a mind-generated monster.
Well, that's kind of what I think of this tulpa kind of thing,
I
too.
think that's the same
idea.
lines. That would make a pretty good, what did you call it, field theory of everything. That would kind of encompass it. Of course, again, taking the skeptical side, you would say that that's a cop-out. You can't explain anyone in particular, so now you're just lumping all the weird creatures into some magical paranormal materializing from the fourth dimension or something. But still, that might be the explanation.
Well, and to kind of segue and she does talk about this as there's several explanations that we've already talked about here, but one of the ones we have talked about has to do with the concept of skinwalker. And a skinwalker is essentially, as I understand it, a Native American magician or Native American. It kind of has a negative connotation to it. It's someone a witch maybe, who would practice black magic. Well, you and I are familiar with, and we mentioned George Knapp here earlier, we're familiar with a book called Hunt for the Skinwalker, which is about a place the story is about a place in northern Utah, which seems to be a portal for a family living on this ranch, where just like I don't know what you call it, like a cornucopia or circus of paranormal events happen, including large wolf-like creatures. So there's where she brings in, so something paranormal, something interdimensional, something that might be associated with a vortex could be an explanation of the dogman phenomena.
And now, isn't a wolf a very powerful image,
symbol,
an archetype symbol in Native American belief system, ancient in particular, compared to, say, other animals? Although every animal had its own niche, it seems like there's something very powerful about a wolf.
Yeah,
a wolf.
And how she talks about that in this book is she uses another animal that we're familiar with, a bear, to talk about this notion of, we oftentimes refer to rather irrational behavior as people going berserk, and that term actually has an origin in not so much mythology but history, in that some Scandinavian societies, particular warriors in Scandinavian societies, felt that if you could don the clothing, well, not clothing, I guess, I'm describing human, if you could don the skin of an animal, you could essentially become that animal. And what they did, and where this idea of berserk came from, was they donned the skins of bears. So they were first known as berserkers, and then that just kind of evolved into the term that we have in society today, where we prefer somebody who might be kind of unhinged, and they were talking about a warrior who would be just tremendously pumped up with aggression, as being one of these berserkers. So I think the same thing would apply to wolves, and probably she has a section in here about the origins of the werewolf legend, is that there is some kind of connection with that early societies donned the skins of wolves and other animals so that they could take on their characteristics and maybe be more effective in battle than if they didn't have those characteristics. And of course, putting on a wolf skin, it doesn't seem like there's too far-fetched thought process needed to then think about you becoming the wolf. The transformation from man into wolf that we saw, like in that universal horror movie of the 1930s that I just love with Lon Chaney Jr., the Wolfman. I mean, that's where that kind of idea originates. So yeah, there are a lot of connections there, some of which you could probably find historically in terms of just understanding how people live their lives, and then some of them seem to be tied into these magical places. And interdimensional kinds of things.
Well, and the other thing that pops out to me as far as a wolf goes is the connection, the werewolf, specifically the connection between that and the moon, which brings in a whole other realm of potential influence. We know that the moon influences Earth in a lot of ways and potentially in astrological ways. I'm not a big astrologist, but there is evidence that the positions of the heavenly bodies may affect humans in some way, the human mind, and you bring that into the equation, and the Wolfman, the werewolf, really seems like it has a lot behind it.
Yeah, it does.
When it goes into symbolism and potentially paranormal type stuff. So I can see why that character is attractive to us to think about, and may literally be attractive. We may literally be creating or materializing that character because of these connections that we know of. Of course, over the years we've kind of lost the meaning, I think, behind the moon and the symbolism of transforming into an animal, like you're saying with berserkers. That brings in the idea of going crazy too, which is another, you might argue, a transition, a mental transition.
Well, I was thinking about the term lunatic, which I'm sure has a connection to how the moon affected people's psyches, and then that once again, it's not very far to imagine that being connected with morphing into an animal.
It's all very close to that veil. If there is one that separates us from a higher realm or another realm, that you just get the feeling that you're dancing really close to that veil when you start getting into these types of creatures.
One thing that Linda Godfrey points out, and I think this influences us too, is that so much of what we think we know about werewolves, and once again I'm distinguishing these dogmen and man-wolf characters from werewolves, because no one reports in any of her anecdotal stuff, no one reports witnessing a transformation from man into wolf. They just see these wolf-like creatures. But she goes to great lengths to talk about that movie I just referred to a little bit ago, The Wolfman, starring Lon Chaney Jr. back in the 30s. I believe it was the 30s that Universal made all those horror movies. But that's really created a whole mythology about werewolves that's not true at all. Silver bullets, wolf's bane, some of those things that we might associate a behavior that we could associate with a werewolf is really just a product of what you saw in that Universal horror movie, and has nothing to do with some of the more, some of the more ancient stories about lycanthropy, which is that idea that a person thinks they're a wolf and then they start acting like a wolf. So I guess, whether we're talking about Bigfoot or whether we're talking about the Michigan Dogman or the man-wolf, we're dealing with tremendously interesting images, creatures that have magical, mystical qualities about them in the case of, definitely in the case of Bigfoot, and maybe as implied in the case of the Dogman or the man-wolf. Creatures are kind of like us in some respects, a bipedal wolf, a large kind of ape-like creature that's really not an ape, but it's a part human. So maybe that's the reason we get to talk about all these things, is they're so fascinating.
And what I like about this subject in particular is that maybe unlike others, there's such a wide range to discover and think about, whether you're a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic or you're just the most believing believer out there.
Yeah.
You can focus on, hopefully this will bring from the skeptical side, people will start looking at the hard science that we have, but then you move into the mythical side that we've been discussing over the last half hour or so, and that attracts a lot of people who just like thinking about that softer side and the more creative side. But I think, everyone, it sounds corny, I guess, but everyone can find something to love about Bigfoot.
Or the Michigan Dogman.
Or the Dogman, yeah.
Yeah, we can relate to that. So I guess the next time I'll see you is when we get together at the first meeting of the people for the ethical treatment of Sasquatch.
Right, pets. I like that. Although I would not like to have a pet Bigfoot.
No.
I'm sure the feeling would be mutual.
Yeah, I think we learned some of the downsides of that from the movie Harry and the Hendersons. Do you remember that from the 80s?
I think I avoided watching that.
I couldn't.
Luckily, but
I couldn't because it was about Bigfoot.
Well, hopefully we'll have less of the Bigfoot jokes and more of the serious discussion.
Right.
If Bigfoot is really among us, how does that make us reassess the world, our place in it, and can we really get our act together to, figure out how to protect this creature and integrate it as much as it wants to be integrated? If I was a Sasquatch, I admit I would not want to be part of the human race, and
right.
I think that's kind of how the group has acted so far.
Yeah, and maybe it's just a matter of time until our discussion about and our exploration of Wolfmen also leads us to a deeper understanding about what the world really is all about and what our place is. Yeah.
Well, we can learn from every other species out there, I think, whether it's real or only sometimes real or just materializing.
Sure.
Who knows what's happening? It's all very interesting. That's why we talk about it.
It keeps us doing these podcasts. All right, Dave. Thanks for being a part of this. We'll see you next time on Anomalies.